Me Talk Pretty One Day by David Sedaris, book review. So this is another one of my scripted book reviews in which I go through an old blog post I wrote 10 years ago and make a YouTube video out of it for whatever that may or may not be worth. In this case, this is the book Me Talk Pretty One Day by humorist David Sedaris, which I picked up on my sister's recommendation. So my sister, who's studied linguistics in school and spent spent some time in France learning French and other European languages, was mentioning this book one day at a family dinner and talking about how funny this book was because it talked about David Sedaris' struggles to learn French. And my sister was relating parts of it like he could never keep straight which objects were feminine and which objects are masculine, right? This is something we don't have to deal with in English, but something you have to deal with in Romance languages. And so there's a part in the book where in order to keep it all straight, in his apartment, he imagines a soap opera between the feminine objects and the masculine objects. So like, you know, the book and the table and the lamp and the chair and who's dating who and who's breaking up with who. And he makes this big elaborate soap opera just so he can keep track of what are the masculine nouns and what are the feminine nouns. So she was saying all that, and it sounded pretty funny, number one, and two, it sounded like it might be useful for me in a way because I was at the time getting ready to study applied linguistics in graduate school, which is something I hadn't studied before, and I was a little bit nervous about it. Applied linguistics, one of the subheadings under applied linguistics is second language acquisition. So a story about somebody's struggles to learn a second language actually would fit quite nicely in the studies of applied linguistics. There are probably a lot more serious textbooks I should be reading, but I made this plan that I was going to ease myself in gradually by starting off with some very light reading first and then work my way up to some heavier reading. I was reading this book at work actually, and a coworker asked me why I was reading it, and I said, well, this is to help me get ready for graduate school with applied linguistics. And he thought I was crazy, and he probably was. He said, that book is not going to help you at all. There are much more serious books you should be reading. And he was probably right. Nonetheless, I do count this book one of the books I've read for my studies in linguistics and second language acquisition. Now, that being said, this book is 272 pages long, and of that, only about maybe 10 pages are related to David Sedaris' language studies. So you certainly wouldn't want to buy it just for that. I didn't realize that at the time I bought it. The other essays are on a wide range of subjects. This is a compilation book. But I enjoyed the book well enough. It was a pleasant enough read, so I'm not complaining. Apparently, each one of these books was originally published separately in a magazine as like a humorous piece in its own right. And it was later compiled into a book. And it reads like the hodgepodge it is. The jumps between different chapters are a bit jarring because everything's on a completely different topic. You know, the characters are, the different people surrounding David Sedaris are different. The location is often different. David Sedaris has a reputation as a great humorist. But I've got to say, I wasn't overly impressed with the humor. I found it was just so-so. Now, some of it is better than others. Like, there are some moments when he's really funny. When he's on, he's really on. But in between the laugh out loud moments, there's a lot of spots that are just mildly amusing. It's pleasant enough to read, but I didn't think it was all that funny. What saves this book, though, is that even when Sedaris isn't quite hitting all the laugh marks, he never gets boring. You get drawn into all his stories and find yourself smiling a little bit at the bizarreness, which is just everyday life. For example, when David Sedaris describes all the wackiness of his family, you think to yourself, I guess every family has its quirks. When he describes his career as a drugged-out wannabe artist, you think, hey, yeah, I guess I'm not the only one who's screwed up. When he describes all the menial jobs he's worked over the years and all the humiliations they entailed, you think to yourself, I'm glad I'm not the only one. So I got a fair amount of interest out of reading this book for just the insights into David Sedaris' life, which makes it a question about whether or not it matters whether all these stories are true. Because about the time I read this book, about 10 years ago, a little bit more, there was a bit of a minor controversy around David Sedaris. There's a guy named Alex Hurd who published an article in the New Republic. Alex Hurd actually investigated a lot of the stories that pop up in David Sedaris' books, including, I believe, this one, Me Talk Pretty One Day, and came to the conclusion that a lot of them were just completely made up, like completely fictionalized. And even the ones that were not completely fictionalized were largely fictionalized. To which a few different questions came out of this. One was, how is this accurate or not? I mean, were these stories actually fictionalized or not? I think David Sedaris pushed back on that a little bit. But the other question is, does it even matter? Because there were a lot of people who said, well, yeah, obviously these stories aren't real. He's a humorist. He's just trying to make stuff funny. Of course he's exaggerating everything for comic effect or inventing stuff. And Alex Hurd said, no, it does matter. If these stories didn't really happen to him, he should be saying that they didn't really happen to him. Now, all of these are questions that are much bigger than me, and I'm not going to try and give a definitive answer on it, other than to say I enjoyed this book much more when I thought these stories were all true. Well, once I found out that these were largely invented stories, then I was like, oh, well, it's not quite as neat anymore. Which is probably why David Sedaris initially did not want to advertise that these stories were largely fabricated. Anyways, moving on to other parts of the book. The second half of the book was written while Sedaris was in France. And this is the part where we get into his observation of French life, cultural classes, and his struggles to learn the French language. I also have spent a fair amount of time abroad. At the time I was reading this book, I had spent 8 years in Japan. So I felt like I could identify with some of it. Some of the cultural clashes, some of the outside perspective a foreign country gives you. Also, while I was in Japan, at one point I enrolled in a full-time Japanese course. So I was studying Japanese for like 6 hours a day in a language school. I was 30 years old at the time, and almost all the other students were 18 and 19-year-old Chinese university students, college students. David Sedaris had a very similar case. He was 40 years old at the time, so 10 years older than I was, although I've caught up to him since then, but at the time 10 years older than me. He was in a class with a bunch of 18 and 19-year-olds, and he felt a bit out of place, just like I did. He had a terrible teacher in this, according to the book. Again, assuming it's not exaggerated. But despite that, he does describe his tremendous sense of accomplishment when he realizes he can understand everything the language teacher is saying to him in French, even though he's not good enough to formulate a reply. And this was something I identified 110% with. When I was studying at the Japanese school, I remember feeling this tremendous sense of accomplishment when I could understand all the directions that were given in Japanese, or when I could understand the grammar explanation that the teacher gave in Japanese. In fact, I felt such a tremendous feeling of accomplishment I remember I used to get so proud of myself that I would think, oh, isn't this great? I can understand everything. And then I would forget to listen to the second half of the explanation because I'd be so busy thinking about how great it was that I was understanding everything the teacher was saying. Yeah, and there's a lot of other things in here. I'm not going to go on and list all of them, but a lot of stuff about living abroad that I'm sure anybody who's spent time abroad can identify with. I also enjoyed Sedaris' description of American exceptionalism and why it sometimes fails to impress other countries. Quoting now from page 107 of this book, David Sedaris says, quote, "Every day we're told that we live in the greatest country on earth, and is always stated as an undeniable fact. Leos are born between July 23 and August 22nd. Fitted queen-size sheets measure 60 by 80 inches, and America is the greatest country on earth. Having grown up with this in our ears, it's startling to realize that other countries have nationalistic slogans of their own, none of which are, 'We're number two.'" End quote. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this review, this book covers such a wide variety of topics. Second half is all about him being in France, but the first half is just all over. So it's a bit difficult to summarize, but I'm just going to close on one little interesting tidbit of information I learned from this book. From this book, I learned that the song "I'd Like to Teach the World to Sing in Perfect Harmony" was actually a Coca-Cola jingle from the 1970s, which at the time I read this book, I had no idea about. Since then, actually, this has become a little bit more famous as a pop culture trivia because it was featured in the Mad Men finale, this famous Coca-Cola commercial. But I had no idea before that. And when I was growing up in the 1980s, I remember hearing this song, you know, like on children's records or children's programs. And I just assumed it was a well-established folk song. I had no idea it was actually an advertisement for Coca-Cola. So there you go. You learn